On the Track is a web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy!
Rossiter, how's things going down at the Youth Outreach Centre in Brixton?
Oh, Barney, some of the kids, and they have been saying that when they leave school, they want to work behind bars. So I've been teaching them how to mix cocktails from the medicine cabinet.
I never cease to be impressed by young Rossiter. He is such a community-minded young fellow. We could all learn a lot from him. Well done to everybody involved.
I really like the old credits.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John Downs. I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and I'm the presenter of this singular web TV show, which every Wednesday evening and Saturday afternoon broadcast, if that's the right word, a show about hard science, weird shit, and surreality. What's surreality? Well, if you don't know by now, do you think I should tell them what surreality is, Hennis?
No, I don't think you should. If they can't be bothered to listen whenever we've told them in the past what surreality is, then they can go and stick their heads in a...
Hennis has been very naughty, and so I've sent him back to his little house behind the compost heap. But I think the fact that you have a serious programme about cryptozoology, green issues, wildlife, natural history and all sorts of other things being presented by an elderly fat hippie and his co-presenter being a make-believe chicken who lives behind the compost heap probably explains surreality as much as it needs to be explained. Well, this week I've had some very interesting news, and just to put it into perspective, because as you all know, I film these things a couple of weeks in advance. Today, as I'm filming it, is tea time on Sunday the 10th of July, which would, by the way, have been my late wife's birthday, so happy birthday, Karina, my love, if you can hear this in any way or shape or form. And when people ask me, do I believe in the afterlife, I say, a bit like Joel Durrell says, that there isn't enough information yet, but nobody has managed to fax back a reliable account, so we have to wait and see for ourselves. But I am, what's the word? I've forgotten it. Digressing. I'm digressing, because I have some really interesting news this week, which refers to two of the stories that I have been yammering on about quite a lot for the last few years.
Oh dear, the silly old fool's going to be talking about butterflies again.
Be quiet, Hennis. I told you to go back to the compost heap and leave me alone. Any more of this and you won't get any porridge. He's right. It is about butterflies. But first of all, I want to remind you of what has been probably my favourite book of the last 5 years. It was sent to me as a birthday present 2 years ago by my old dear sweet friend and adopted nephew, Dr. Max Blake.
Dr. Max! Dr. Max!
Who is now something incredibly important working for the Forestry Commission. But he sent me this book. It's called Wilding, and it's by Isabella Tree, and it tells the story of how she and her husband and their team took an old farm around a ruined castle in Sussex, and because the farm itself was no longer viable to make money, they didn't know what to do with it. It hadn't been making money for years and years and years, so they decided to see what happened if they did nothing, rather than rewilding it, letting it wild itself. And this is a remarkable book, and I've been giving it to people as birthday and Christmas presents ever since, because I think it is the most inspirational book I've read in years. Carl Marshall's dad certainly agrees with me, because he read it twice straight off after I'd sent a copy for Carl, and he pinched it and read it himself, like I said, twice. Possibly the most iconic of the rare species which have now recolonised Knepp Park as it gets wilder and wilder is the turtledove. As you can see from the cover of the book, a magnificent and very, very beautiful bird, which was once very common in England, but has become rarer and rarer and rarer, mostly due to loss of habitat. The name turtledove has nothing at all to do with tortoises, turtles or terrapins. It's an old Latin name which is onomatopoeic describing its call. Listen to this piece of footage which I was sent recently, again by Dr. Max Blake.
Dr. Max! Dr. Max!
You can hear the distinctive tur sound that the male makes, and you can see why our ancient Roman ancestors decided to call the bird the turtledove. Like I said, it has nothing at all to do with tortoises or turtles. But due to the rewilding, or rather wilding, experiments carried out by Isabella Tree and her husband, they are now a common sight and a common sound in that part of Sussex. Like so many rare birds that migrate across Europe from Africa, the turtledove, which winters in sub-Saharan Africa and then moves north again to North Africa and quite a bit of Europe in order to breed, is under threat from the increasing amount of wildlife crime taking place in Malta. Now, stop before any of you start getting arsey with me. I am not being anti-Maltese, I am not being racist, I am not being white privilege, I'm not being anything. But there is an absolute torrent of wildlife crime happening in Malta, a lot of it being illegal trapping and shooting of migratory birds, and it is absolutely fucking disgusting. And if I get some messages from the Maltese government telling me that I'm attacking the Maltese way of life, this footage is freely available on YouTube, but as it's Creative Commons license, I decided to show it here because it does show how the poaching industry amongst wild birds in Malta. Okay, I possibly should have rephrased that because it sounded like I was saying the wild birds are doing the poaching, but I believe that the people who watch this show have got more brains than to fall for some stupid grammatical error that I make. I think that this is remarkable footage because it shows you how very, very rare birds like golden plovers are being preyed upon by these people. Now, I also want to make it perfectly clear I have no beef with Malta. I won't pretend to know much about the Maltese way of life, but over the years I've met various Maltese people. Most recently, the one that comes to mind is Paul Veller, who sadly is dead now, but he was the guy who ran the CFZ BHM study group before Glenn Vaudrey does it now, but before Glenn Vaudrey took it over, Paul ran it for years, and he was a lovely, lovely guy. I have no beef against Malta or its people. But, and here's a big but, the wildlife crime epidemic there is absolutely appalling. But now I want to go from something that has nothing to do with turtles to something which has everything to do with them, still at Knepp Park. Regular viewers will, I'm sure, be aware of my interest in a butterfly called the large tortoiseshell. It has been rare in Britain for the last 100 years, and is generally thought to have become extinct in these islands sometime in the mid-1950s. I certainly have never seen one. Not alive, anyway. But in recent years, sightings have increased, and in the last few years there have even been well-attested reports of these creatures breeding. Last year, I think, for example, they were reported having bred in Sussex, in Norfolk, on the Isle of Wight, and on the island of Portland in Dorset. And this year, guess where they have been reported breeding? Yep, Knepp Park in Sussex. And this should probably come as no surprise to any of you watching this show, because I've been talking about Knepp Park for an enormous percentage of the show so far. But now the big question has got to be asked. Why? Why and how did they become established here at Knepp Park, and how did they breed? And now I'm not talking about the birds and the bees questions, because the answer to that is when a mummy large tortoiseshell and a daddy large tortoiseshell love each other very much, they... Okay, we don't have to go into that. How do you say hello, my darling? But the big question isn't how the nuts and bolts of them breeding takes place, that's fairly well established, but how and why did this creature, which is supposed to be extinct in the United Kingdom, end up in the gardens of Knepp Park? I find it hard to believe that Mother Nature sends out a sort of scattershot payload of large tortoiseshells to go and fly willy-nilly across southern England until they find somewhere that's appropriate for them to breed. But this seems to be exactly what's happening. This would have seemed extremely unlikely even half a century ago, because when I was at school in the 1970s, there were 4 or 5 of us in my class alone who were interested in butterflies and who, to our current shame, collected butterflies. So the idea of large numbers of large tortoiseshells flying across southern England looking for a place to breed would be quite unlikely, because they would have been seen by someone. But although there have been large tortoiseshells seen, quite a few of them this year, they have not been seen in the numbers that one would have imagined were going to be needed for these quite regular occurrences of breeding to take place. So we're left with 2 questions, 2 possible explanations. 1, they've been here all along. They may or may not have gone extinct back in the 1950s, but for some years they've been breeding here and quietly expanding their range and nobody's noticed. Or 2, and this is the really embarrassing one, Are we so divorced as a society from the realities of the natural world that we don't notice such things as a supposedly extinct butterfly flying across our path when we're on our way to catch the new Pokemon Go? I know which one I think it is. This is Dartmoor. It's one of my favourite places in the world. I first came here when I was 9 years old, and my family and I were staying near Widdicombe in the Moor, a beautiful little village in the middle of the moor itself. This was in the summer of 1969, 53 years ago, and I still remember it as if it were yesterday. I go back regularly and expect that I shall do so for the rest of my life. However, I've also been there on a professional basis. One time, particularly a few years ago, I was asked by an American TV company if I could analyse this footage, which to me is almost certainly a wild boar. In 2008, I believe, animal rights activists liberated a load of wild boar, including pregnant sows, in the vicinity of Bahrija Reservoir, and I think that's Bahrija Reservoir in the background. And I know that wild boar are seen quite regularly in this part of Dartmoor, and although this is a terribly grainy and horrible piece of footage, I think that it is undoubtedly footage of a wild boar. However, for reasons best known to themselves, the TV company responsible decided that it fit the narrative of their show to claim that this was not a wild boar, it was a cross between an escaped lion and a wild boar, which genetically is the biggest load of codswallop I've heard in ages. Evolutionarily, it would have taken millions and millions and millions of years for something like that to happen, even if it were going to, even if it were even slightly possible for pigs and big cats to interbreed, which it isn't. Absolute nonsense, and it did my public persona quite a lot of harm, because for ages people were saying, well, John Downes claims a wild boar can interbreed with big cats. I didn't claim anything of the sort, and luckily the story's now died down, but what I can tell you is that I piled on every expense that I could onto my expenses sheet for this day's shooting, and for less than a day's work I came away with enough money to be able to feed the entirety of the CFZ for nearly a fortnight. Well, sometimes you do what you have to do. There are a number of mysteries on Dartmoor which have fascinated me over the years, and which I will almost certainly return to in these shows. But the one I want to talk about today is quite an unpleasant thing which happened in April 1977 in Cherry Brook Valley, which is to the northwest of Widdicombe in the Moor. 15 dead ponies were discovered, and accounts vary as to whether they were found with no injuries at all, whether they were completely mutilated, or whether all their bones had been broken. And the big problem is that I've been trying to get hold of the police reports on this for a long time, but without any success. And if anybody out there is better at negotiating Freedom of Information Act requests than I am, please get in touch, because I would like to get hold of these. But the thing that's weird about this is that all sorts of strange and mostly, I'm sure, erroneous explanations have been given. They've been the killings were blamed on UFOs, they were blamed on cultists, they were blamed on a mysterious sect of witches who lived in the area, and most prosaically, the deaths were blamed on a group of local teenagers with motorbikes who apparently, or allegedly, because there's no actual evidence that they ever existed, enjoyed nothing more than to ride at a speed across the moor and stampede the wild or semi-wild ponies and make them fall over cliffs. And an even more prosaic explanation is that the bodies were found all over the moor and were dumped in one place by a local farmer who didn't want to be charged for the disposal of the carcasses. The CFZ got involved with the case about 30 years ago, when my first wife, Alison, contacted a well-known representative of the Dartmoor Ponies Association who had been quoted many times during the available press cuttings on the subject, and she was really angry at being bothered. She was saying that she'd had enough of us pestering her about this case, that it was all perfectly well solved and we should leave it alone. And this actually somewhat threw me, because we'd never pestered her. This was in 1993, the original case had taken place in 1977, and during those intervening years we had never done anything at all about it. But it makes one wonder whether the poor woman had just been pestered by loads and loads of self-styled fortune researchers, all wanting to know the details of the case, or whether something like this from John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, had taken place. I kept a careful log of the crank calls I received, and eventually catalogued the various tactics of the mysterious pranksters. Some of these tactics are so elaborate that they could not be the work of a solitary nut harassing UFO believers in his spare time. Rather, it all appears to be the work of either paranormal forces or a large and well-financed operation by a large and well-financed organisation with motives that evade me. I have always been a fan of this book, The Mothman Prophecies, although I have to say that I am not too sure how much of it is actually objective truth and how much of it is the work of an imaginative and highly skilled writer, which John Keel obviously and undoubtedly was. And that's about all I know. There have been other theories advanced of what killed the ponies. One of the more peculiar, but unfortean, is that they all ate a poisonous plant called the bog asphodel. But if ponies were prone to doing that, surely there would be large amounts of dead poisoned ponies every year. I also, partly tongue-in-cheek and partly because it's the sort of thing Doc Shields would have done, I added to my account of this, which was in my book The Owlman and Others back in 1997, I added to this that this was the year that Bob Dylan had recorded a song which was called New Pony and was about a pony named Lucifer. Nobody actually picked up on that apart from Doc Shields, but I enjoyed coming up with the idea. So, what can we do to finally find out what killed these poor unfortunate little horses? I don't know. I'd like to ask you guys for your suggestions. I've got a letter in my possession which I cannot, for copyright reasons, show you, which tells a well-known UFO researcher who I fell out with some years ago that they have no records of the case, and this was sent to them by the Devon and Cornwall Constabulary Police Archive Museum. But I do want to know what happened, and if any of you can come up with any bright ideas about what we can do to put this case to bed once and for all, please let me know.
If you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer, who is an ever more regular visitor to my little studio, wants me to remind you, always press the notification bell. Otherwise you won't be told when there's a new show to watch.
And that would be an awful pity, wouldn't it?
And that, my dears, is about it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to say a big thank you, first of all, to dear Graham, who once again is not very well, but he's still looking after me and helping this ridiculous organisation keep afloat. I also want to say a big thank you to Louis, my producer, who's a complete darling and not only produces the show, but pretty good at managing to bolster me up when I go into some sort of weird crisis or other. And I want to say a big thank you to Miss Maxine, who has been by my side and helping me do this episode and giving me inestimably good advice all the way through. Thank you, my dear. I really do appreciate it. And that's about it then. So, what have we got coming up for you? I have no idea. I know I say this each time, but I always mean to have shows planned out in advance, but I never do. I know that sometime the next week I'm interviewing Steve Andrews and talking to him not only about his new butterfly book, but about the work he's done with non-migratory populations of monarch butterflies in southern Spain and Portugal, which is something that fascinates the hell out of me. And we'll also be hearing his song, Butterfly in My Beard, which, as he has a big green bushy beard, will be fantastic treat for us all. So that's it. I'll be back on Wednesday, and I'll be back next Saturday afternoon, because Saturday afternoon is CFZ time, and nothing, of course, of any importance in the world happens that outshines our Saturday afternoon shows. So I'll be there. I hope you'll be there, because if you are you waiting, Mr. McCrinnan? You know V. McCrinnan always tries to talk along with this, and so I always do it in a slightly different way just to confuse him, because I love V. McCrinnan. He's a dear, sweet man, and I've known him, golly, nearly a third of a century, since the late 80s, and he's a complete darling. So, V, are you ready? 3, 2, 1... I'll be seeing you.